In the summer of 1218, at Otrar in Central Asia, 450 men with bound hands knelt in the dust, enduring the merciless Central Asian sun. A palpable dread filled the air around these Muslim merchants, who had journeyed thousands of miles, transporting valuable silks from China, furs from Siberia, and unimaginable quantities of silver, gold, and other treasures. One of them, in Persian, desperately pleaded for their lives, emphasizing their status as mere traders with families. Governor Inalchuk, a heavy-set man with piercing, cold eyes and an insatiable greed, stood atop the city walls. He calculated the worth of their cargo, recognizing it as enough to acquire a small kingdom and elevate him to the wealthiest position in the Khwarazmian Empire. Drumming his fingers on the stone parapet, "Spies," he declared flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are all Mongol spies." They fervently denied the accusation, swearing by Allah. However, Inalchuk had already made up his mind. He had sought guidance from his nephew, Shah Muhammad II, on how to handle the merchants. The Shah's decisive and unambiguous response was to quote Tufan. The governor then signaled, and the executioners advanced. What followed extended over many hours, as all 450 men were individually beheaded. Their blood soaked into the arid ground of Otrar, and their extraordinary possessions, including a gold nugget the size of a camel's neck, were confiscated and distributed. Among these items was a personal offering, intended as a symbol of peace from one leader to another, now met with mass slaughter. Only one individual, a camel driver, managed to evade the chaos, fleeing across 1,500 miles of steppe and desert. He didn't stop until he reached the court of Genghis Khan, the very man who had dispatched the caravan. Upon hearing the camel driver's account of the executions, the theft, and the blatant disrespect, a transformation occurred in the Khan's demeanor. 3 years later, an entire empire would vanish from history, not merely conquered or defeated, but utterly erased. This narrative chronicles how a solitary act of avarice and hubris ignited the most brutal military campaign of the medieval era. It's the history of the siege of Samarkand and the day Persia fell to the Mongols. Our story's antagonist is Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II. After years of studying this period, I perceive him as nothing less than the villain. In 1218, he governed the Khwarazmian Empire, which stretched from China's borders to the Persian Gulf, appearing immensely impressive on maps. He controlled significant Silk Road cities, such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench, proclaiming himself the second Alexander. Yet, Muhammad II was a paradox, a conqueror incapable of governance, a warrior lacking leadership, a Shah who built an empire on shaky ground. Muhammad had spent 2 decades expanding his territory, conquering from the Seljuk Turks, the Ghurids, and any other faction he could vanquish. By 1217, his dominion extended from the Sir Darya River to the Persian Gulf. Critically, these were recent acquisitions, and his subjects neither admired nor even liked him. Historian C.E. Bosworth noted that his dynasty was deeply unpopular, a focal point for public animosity. In no province did the Khwarazm Shahs manage to forge a shared interest with their populace. Imagine ruling a vast empire where no one truly desires your presence. The situation worsened. Muhammad distrusted his generals, his advisors, and even most of his sons, with the exception of Jalal al-Din, his eldest, who was likely the family's sole competent military mind. Furthermore, his mother, Turkan Khatun, known as the Queen of the Turks, still wielded considerable imperial power, establishing what historians termed an unstable co-rule. It was a volatile situation, constantly exacerbated by Muhammad's actions. In 1217, he attempted to march on Baghdad to compel the caliph to acknowledge him as Shah. However, his army was caught in a blizzard in the Zagros Mountains, resulting in thousands of soldier deaths and a humiliating retreat, a significant red flag. His treatment of his own cities was equally destructive. In 1212, following a rebellion in Samarkand, he massacred 10,000 citizens. Later, passing through Nishapur, he had to ask citizens to rebuild walls that his father had destroyed during a prior conquest. He was defending cities he himself had previously damaged, another critical red flag. But his greatest flaw was his strategic judgment. Upon hearing about the rising Mongol threat from the east, and after his advisors warned him about Genghis Khan, a warlord who had just conquered northern China and was now turning his gaze towards Central Asia, Muhammad made a disastrous decision. Ignoring the widespread distribution of troops, his strategy was flawed. Upon learning of the escalating Mongol presence to the east, and after his advisors informed him about a warlord named Genghis Khan, who had recently subdued northern China and was now casting his gaze upon Central Asia, Muhammad II made a grave error in judgment. He opted to scatter his forces, stationing soldiers in every significant urban center. Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Balkh, and Otrar all received garrisons with instructions to hold their ground. His rationale stemmed from the expectation of a typical Mongol incursion, the kind nomadic groups had carried out for centuries, a quick raid, pillaging the countryside, bypassing cities, and then retreating. He dismissed the Mongols as merely another band of steppe nomads, dangerous, certainly, but no match for his fortified cities. He was oblivious to the true nature of the impending threat. 1,500 miles to the east, Genghis Khan was assembling an unprecedented military machine. He had united the Mongol tribes, an achievement never before accomplished. He had forged a military organization founded on merit, not lineage, where his commanders were chosen for their prowess in battle, not their birthright. His army operated with a level of discipline that would have impressed even a Roman legion. Crucially, Genghis Khan had spent years battling the Jin dynasty while conquering northern China. During this period, he had acquired expertise in siege warfare from Chinese engineers. The Mongols were no longer solely horse archers. They had evolved into a sophisticated combined arms force, incorporating cavalry, siege weaponry, and engineers capable of breaching any fortification. Nonetheless, in 1218, Genghis Khan harbored no desire for conflict with the Khwarazmian Empire. He had just concluded years of warfare in China, his army was fatigued, and his empire needed a period of consolidation. His objective was trade and commerce. He dispatched an envoy to Muhammad II, carrying a message that, according to the Persian historian Minhaj-e-Siraj, read, "I govern the lands of the rising sun, while you reign over those of the setting sun. Let us strike a firm treaty of friendship and peace." This was a genuine proposal. The Mongols had always been as invested in trade as they were in warfare, preferring to control the Silk Road through alliances rather than conquest and to generate wealth instead of creating casualties. When Muhammad II received this message, he responded favorably, agreeing to establish trade relations. The ensuing war, the empire's annihilation, and the untold deaths could all have been averted. In the spring of 1218, a caravan of 500 camels set off from the Mongol court, journeying westward. Each camel bore 400 pounds of goods, totaling 200,000 pounds of treasure, gold, silver, iridescent Chinese silks, luxurious Siberian sable furs, jade, ivory, a vast fortune in merchandise. Leading this caravan were 450 Muslim merchants, deliberately chosen by Genghis Khan for a mission to a Muslim empire, a shrewd diplomatic move. Among them was a Mongol official, an ambassador laden with gifts, including a gold nugget reportedly the size of a camel's neck. The caravan was in high spirits, anticipating immense profits. The Silk Road was about to flourish once more, with the Mongols managing its eastern leg and the Khwarazmians overseeing the western end, promising a boom in trade. These individuals were on the cusp of unimaginable wealth. They reached Otrar in the summer of 1218. Located on the Sir Darya River in present-day Kazakhstan, Otrar was a border city, a significant trading hub, and a strategic junction where caravans from China diverged, heading either west to Europe or south to Persia. It was under the governance of Inalchuk, also known by his title Genghis Khan, who was Shah Muhammad II's uncle. When Inalchuq witnessed the arrival of this caravan, 500 camels, hundreds of merchants, and goods valuable enough to incite envy in legendary figures like Croesus, he coveted it. And here is where the narrative takes a pivotal turn. Some accounts suggest one of the merchants committed a fatal faux pas, addressing Governor Inalchuq by quote 4, which translates to quote 5, rather than his proper title, Genghis Khan, a perceived insult. Others propose that Inalchuq genuinely suspected them of espionage, given the strained relations along the Mongol-Khwarazmian border, leading him to believe it was a reconnaissance mission. However, a simpler explanation seems more probable. He simply desired the immense wealth before him. Inalchuq promptly ordered the arrest of the entire caravan, accusing them of espionage. Crucially, he did not act unilaterally. He sent a message to his nephew, Shah Muhammad II, requesting guidance. The Shah's reply was unequivocal: execute them. This is a critical juncture, a decision point where history could have diverged significantly. Muhammad II could have challenged Inalchuq, asking, "Are you mad? These are merchants under Mongol protection. Send them back with apologies and gifts." He could have disciplined Inalchuq for even suggesting such an act. He could have recognized that the Mongols, having just conquered northern China, were not a power to provoke. Instead, he commanded their deaths. Following the Shah's orders, all 450 merchants were executed. Inalchuq confiscated the goods and dispatched a portion to Muhammad II. A camel driver who later escaped reported that the executions extended over most of a day. 450 men were brutally murdered for the sole offense of attempting to conduct trade. Upon learning of the events, Genghis Khan's lieutenants braced themselves for an outburst, anticipating an immediate declaration of war and mobilization. Yet, astonishingly, he remained calm. Instead, to everyone's utter bewilderment, he opted for diplomacy once more. He dispatched 3 envoys to Muhammad's court, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols. Their message was straightforward: reprimand Governor Inalchuq for his transgression, compensate the families of the deceased merchants, and move beyond this incident. This was an opportunity for Muhammad to save face. He could lay all blame on Inalchuq, surrender him, offer some monetary atonement, and thus avert a conflict with Asia's most formidable military power. The ambassadors arrived at Muhammad's court expecting discussions, but what ensued was beyond imagining. Muhammad II ordered the Muslim ambassador to be decapitated. He then commanded his soldiers to shave the beards of the 2 Mongol envoys before sending them back to Genghis Khan. For those unfamiliar with Mongol customs, a man's beard held profound significance, symbolizing his manhood, honor, and dignity. To forcibly remove it was an act of profound humiliation, a deliberate and calculated affront that effectively communicated __quote_8__. The 2 beardless Mongol emissaries, bearing the head of their slain colleague, returned to their Khan, who received them in his tent. Accounts describe Genghis Khan sitting in silence for a prolonged period, gazing at what Muhammad had sent: the head of a man who had sought peace, and the disgraced countenances of 2 ambassadors. Then, as numerous sources attest, Genghis Khan smiled, not a joyful smile, but a terrifying one. He dismissed everyone from his tent, ascended a nearby mountain, and, according to legend, prayed in solitude for 3 days and 3 nights. Upon his descent, his decision was made. He convened his generals and uttered words that would forever resonate. __quote _9___. If you're finding this narrative engaging, be sure to hit that like button, as the unfolding events are about to become exceptionally brutal, and subscribe to delve deeply into the military strategies that facilitated this. The Mongol war machine was poised for deployment, and Shah Muhammad II, in his hubris and folly, had sealed the fate of everything he had constructed. But first, Genghis Khan had to prepare. This preparation would span months during which Muhammad could have altered the course of events in countless ways, yet he did not. By autumn 1219, in the mountainous regions of Mongolia and northern China, the largest military force ever assembled by the Mongols began to converge. Modern historians estimate its strength between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, while medieval chroniclers inflated the figures to 200,000 or more. Regardless, its scale was immense. However, it wasn't merely the size that rendered this army terrifying. It was its composition. 60% comprised light cavalry, horse archers capable of firing arrows at a full gallop, even while retreating, having spent their entire lives on horseback. 40% consisted of heavy cavalry, armored shock troops designed to shatter infantry formations like a hammer through glass. What set them apart from all other nomadic armies in history were their Chinese engineers, numbering over 1,000. These engineers possessed the expertise to construct trebuchets, mangonels, and battering rams. They understood how to undermine fortifications and employed techniques for using naphtha, essentially medieval napalm, to ignite cities. The Khwarazmians believed they were confronting a typical nomadic raid. In reality, they faced the medieval equivalent of a modern combined arms military. Genghis Khan segmented his forces into 4 distinct armies, each assigned a specific objective. The first army, under his eldest son, Jochi, was to sweep north along the Sir Daria River, subjugating smaller cities and towns. The second army, led by Jebe and Subutai, 2 of the most formidable generals in Mongol history, commanders capable of conquering a continent with a mere 1,000 men, would advance southeast, executing a pincer movement. The third army, commanded by Chagatai and Ögedei, his second and third sons, was tasked with besieging Otrar in Elchuk city, the place where this conflict originated, to make an example of it. The fourth army, comprising Genghis himself, accompanied by his youngest son, Tului, and the main force, would target the very heart of the empire. It was a masterstroke of strategic planning. 4 independent armies, each capable of autonomous operation while supporting the others, designed to overwhelm and disorient the Khwarazmian defenders. Meanwhile, in Samarkand, Shah Muhammad II convened with his generals, who were practically imploring him to revise his strategy. "My lord," they urged, "we possess 400,000 soldiers. If we consolidate them, march north, and engage the Mongols in open battle, we can crush them. We outnumber them 4 to 1. This was not unsound advice. In an open-field engagement, with adequate coordination, they might indeed have emerged victorious. The Khwarazmian forces boasted seasoned cavalry, formidable Persian heavy infantry, and even military elephants sourced from India. Yet, Muhammad harbored deep distrust for his own generals, plagued by paranoia of rebellion. He feared that concentrating his troops might empower someone to depose him. This apprehension led him to a fateful choice. Instead of engaging the Mongols in open battle, he would fortify his cities. "No," he declared, "we will defend our cities. Every major stronghold will be garrisoned. The Mongols are nomads. They are unfamiliar with siege warfare. They will waste months assaulting our ramparts while we decimate their ranks." His generals exchanged uneasy glances. A few attempted to voice their concerns, but Muhammad, as the Shah, held absolute authority. Thus, the Khwarazmian Empire fractured its military, dispersing its immense army into isolated contingents, 20,000 here, 15,000 there, 30,000 in Samarkand. It was a vast fighting force, yet utterly fragmented, lacking any meaningful coordination. This, it must be stressed, wasn't merely poor strategy. It was catastrophically flawed, violating every established principle of military engagement. One should never divide their forces when confronting a superior adversary. The Mongols, though numerically smaller, excelled in coordination, discipline, and tactical adaptability. Muhammad II, unbeknownst to him, had sealed his own doom. He believed he had made the prudent decision. His cities were formidable, their walls towering. He envisioned the nomadic Mongols breaking against his fortifications like waves against a cliff. He stationed the majority of his army in Samarkand, his capital, and awaited their arrival. In September 1219, the Mongol army traversed the Syr Darya River, entering Khwarazmian territory and commencing their campaign, though not where Muhammad anticipated. By late September 1219, Chagatai and Ögedei, leading approximately 30,000 troops, reached Otrar. The city, perched on a 20-meter-high earthwork mound, a tobe, with robust walls, was garrisoned by an estimated 20,000 to 60,000 men, though modern historians suggest a more realistic figure of 10,000 to 15,000. Inalchuk, standing atop the walls, observed the Mongol deployment. He understood their purpose. He was, after all, the one who ignited this conflict. To his credit, and it's astounding to acknowledge this about someone responsible for the murder of 450 innocents, Inalchuk resolved to make the Mongols pay dearly for every inch of his city. The siege began, proving unexpectedly challenging for the Mongols. Otrar's elevated position on the tobe forced the Mongols to attack uphill against well-prepared defenses. Their siege engines struggled to achieve optimal angles, and their assaults were repelled with significant losses. Inalchuk, having stockpiled ample food and water, was prepared for a prolonged siege. Days bled into weeks, then weeks into months. October, November, December, January, February, a grueling 5 months. Chagatai and Ögedei grew increasingly exasperated. Their father had already advanced to other objectives. They were meant to swiftly capture the city and rejoin the main campaign. Instead, they languished outside Otrar's walls, suffering casualties and making no headway. Inside the city, morale remained surprisingly strong. They had defied expectations, holding out far longer than anticipated, leading some to wonder if the Mongols were truly invincible. Then, in February 1220, a general named Khwarazmian, one of the Shah's appointed commanders sent as reinforcement, made a pivotal decision. He felt no allegiance to the Shah, nor to Inalchuk. He had witnessed the war's progression. The Mongols had conquered other cities and emerged victorious in every engagement. Khwarazmian, assessing his options, concluded that his best chance of survival lay in switching allegiances. Under the cover of night, Khwarazmian ordered his soldiers to open one of the gates. The Mongols streamed in. The garrison, completely caught off guard, was massacred in their sleep. Most of Inalchuk's forces perished before even realizing what was happening. The city collapsed within hours. However, Khwarazmian's act of betrayal had an unforeseen consequence. He believed he had made a shrewd move, delivering the city to the Mongols, confident in their reward, perhaps a position within the new order. Instead, the Mongols executed him and all his men. When questioned about this decision, Mongol commanders reportedly stated, "We have no use for traitors. If you betrayed your master, you would betray us." This chilling message resonated throughout the region. Surrender early or fight to the bitter end, but never switch sides mid-conflict. Meanwhile, Inalchuk, along with approximately 1/10 of his original garrison, perhaps 1,000 men, retreated to the inner citadel. This fortress within a fortress, their ultimate stronghold, held out for another month. Consider this: the main city had fallen, most of his soldiers were dead, and there was no hope of relief. Yet, Inalchuk continued to resist. The Mongols repeatedly assaulted the citadel, incurring heavy casualties. Inalchuk's archers were precise, and his remaining soldiers, knowing their fate was sealed, fought with desperate ferocity. Finally, the Mongols breached the inner walls, engaging in fierce room-to-room, floor-to-floor combat. Inalchuk found himself on the fortress's highest floor, accompanied by his sole remaining bodyguards. Having expended his arrows and other weapons, he resorted to throwing bricks. This particular detail is often highlighted in historical accounts. The governor, Inalchuk, whose greed ignited this entire conflict and who coldly murdered 450 merchants, stood atop his citadel, casting bricks down at the ascending Mongols, intent on his demise. He reportedly felled several aggressors before being overwhelmed, though captured alive. Genghis Khan had specifically commanded his sons to take Inalchuk living. His retribution gained legendary status. Some historical texts recount Genghis pouring molten silver into Inalchuk's eyes and ears. A grim irony, given his avarice for silver, sparked the war. Other accounts detail varied forms of torture. While the exact methods differ, the outcome remains consistent. Inalchuk endured a slow, agonizing death under Genghis Khan's watchful eye. Following this, the Mongols systematically razed Otrar. They massacred most of its inhabitants, enslaved the survivors, dismantled the fortifications, sabotaged the irrigation systems, and incinerated everything combustible. Otrar effectively ceased to exist as a functional city. Even 150 years later, when Timur traversed the region, it remained in ruins. However, a crucial point to grasp is this. While Chagatai and Ögedei were engrossed in Otrar for 5 months, Genghis Khan and his primary force were not idle. They were on the verge of accomplishing something universally deemed impossible. In October 1219, somewhere within the Khwarazmian Empire, Shah Muhammad II sat in his command center, examining maps and reviewing intelligence from his scouts. The intelligence was concerning, but not catastrophic. Jochi's army was advancing along the Sir Darya, seizing smaller towns. Chagatai and Ögedei were bogged down at Otrar. Jebe and Subutai were probing the southeastern approaches. But Genghis Khan? Where was his main army? Muhammad's scouts couldn't locate them. Last sighted near Otrar, they had simply vanished. 50,000 men, gone without a trace. Muhammad's advisors debated. Perhaps they had withdrawn for winter. Perhaps they were resupplying. Perhaps their strength was overestimated. Muhammad allowed himself a moment of relief. Otrar was holding. Samarkand was well defended. His strategy appeared effective. Let the Mongols exhaust themselves against stone fortifications. Eventually they would withdraw. He remained oblivious that Genghis Khan was, at that very moment, leading 50,000 cavalry across the Kyzyl Kum Desert. The quote 300 miles of absolute hell on earth. Let me illustrate this scene for you. Daytime temperatures soared to 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeting to near freezing by night. There was no water, no vegetation, no shelter. Medieval cartographers explicitly labeled this area as impassable. Yet Genghis Khan marched an army through it. How? Firstly, Mongol cavalry tactics. Each soldier didn't ride a single horse, but a string of 3 or 4. When one tired, he swapped to a fresh mount, and the exhausted horse trailed behind to recuperate. This enabled Mongol cavalry to cover distances that would be lethal for European knights. Secondly, unwavering discipline. Iron discipline. No one broke ranks, no one strayed. Water was precisely rationed, and any man who took more than his allotment was executed on the spot. Thirdly, and this is pivotal, Genghis Khan had guides. The Mongols had assimilated the Chagatai, who had previously governed this territory. They possessed indigenous knowledge. They knew the locations of hidden wells. They were familiar with the ancient caravan routes, paths considered too arduous for most armies. And they understood that if they succeeded, they would emerge exactly where Muhammad least expected them. The journey stretched for weeks. Men perished, horses perished, yet they pressed on. Then, in early February 1220, they emerged from the southern edge of the Kyzyl Kum, 300 miles behind Muhammad's defensive positions. They were at Bukhara on February 10, 1220. The residents of Bukhara looked north, observing approaching dust clouds. A substantial amount of dust, the kind an army generates, but that was impossible. North of Bukhara lay only the Kyzyl Kum. No one could traverse that desert, especially not with an army. The dust clouds drew nearer. Panic began to spread. Bukhara was among the Islamic world's grandest cities, the Dome of Islam in the east, boasting a population of around 300,000, a library containing 45,000 books, and architecture comparable to Baghdad's. It was a hub of scholarship, culture, and affluence. Its garrison comprised approximately 20,000 troops, commanded by Khwarazmian officers, who abruptly realized they faced Genghis Khan's primary army, utterly isolated with no support for 300 miles. They made a decision: attack. It wasn't an entirely flawed notion. Remaining within the walls would eventually lead to starvation. But if they could breach the Mongol lines, they might escape to Samarkand and regroup, or at least perish fighting rather than trapped. The garrison marched out of Bukhara to engage in battle. The Mongols annihilated them. It was a complete rout. The approximately 20,000 soldiers of Bukhara's garrison confronted a formidable force of 50,000 battle-hardened Mongol cavalry, recently emerging from the desert with no inclination towards clemency. The ensuing conflict along the Amu Darya River was an utter butchery. Those who somehow survived the immediate fighting desperately attempted to swim to safety, but mostly drowned. A handful managed to cross and vanished into the surrounding territory. The garrison was utterly wiped out. Observing the city's defenses and the overwhelming Mongol presence, Bukhara's leaders swiftly concluded that surrender was their only option and opened the gates. Genghis Khan entered Bukhara as a legendary conqueror. He proceeded directly to the city's great mosque, its most sacred site, where, according to various accounts, he ascended the pulpit typically reserved for imams. The terrified populace, assembled in the courtyard, was compelled to witness the spectacle, fully aware of the grim fate awaiting cities that dared to resist the Mongols. Through an interpreter, Genghis Khan addressed them, stating, quote, 17, quote, "The psychological potency of this declaration was immense. One was not merely opposing a man, but divine retribution itself, a consequence born of their own wrongdoing, a masterstroke of terrifyingly brilliant propaganda." What unfolded next was systematic and brutal. The Mongols segregated the populace. The first group, comprising artisans, engineers, scribes, and anyone with valuable skills, was spared but enslaved. They were destined for Mongolia, forced to labor in Mongol workshops for the remainder of their lives. The second group consisted of able-bodied men of fighting age who had not actively resisted. They were forcibly conscripted into the Mongol army and would serve as cannon fodder in future sieges. The third group, everyone else, was enslaved and parceled out among the Mongol officers. The members of the surrendered garrison met a swift end. Every single one was executed. Genghis Khan's message was unequivocal: resist and face death, or surrender immediately. However, surrendering after a period of resistance offered no reprieve. Death was still the outcome. The Mongols then proceeded to plunder the city, seizing every valuable item. Subsequently, whether by accident or intention, a fire erupted. Perhaps it was neglected cooking fires, or perhaps it was deliberate incendiary action. Regardless, Bukhara, a city constructed of wood and thatch that had endured for 500 years, was consumed by flames. Upon the Mongols' departure, Bukhara was reduced to smoldering ruins. The dome of Islam in the east was no more than ash. However, the strategic brilliance of this maneuver was profound. Genghis Khan was now positioned west of Samarkand, severing the capital's potential support from Bukhara and other western cities. He had demonstrated his capacity to move and strike wherever he pleased. The seemingly impossible trek through the desert was not merely a tactical triumph. It was a potent psychological weapon. Shah Muhammad, upon receiving the news, finally comprehended the magnitude of the threat he faced, though it was now too late. All routes now pointed to Samarkand. If this account captivates you, consider subscribing. This depth of historical narrative is distinct. We are now approaching the central conflict. In early March 1220, Samarkand, nestled on the Zarafshan River in the heart of Central Asia, specifically in modern-day Uzbekistan, stood. If Bukhara possessed charm, Samarkand was an epitome of magnificence. This metropolis, home to 200,000 residents, thrived thanks to an astounding engineering feat: an aqueduct system that conveyed water from mountains dozens of miles distant to this city on the steppes. It was renowned for its skilled craftspeople, saddle makers whose creations were coveted across Asia, metalworkers who forged copper lamps illuminating palaces from China to Cairo, and weavers who produced silver lame cloth more precious than gold. This was the illustrious capital of the Khwarazmian Empire, Shah Muhammad's seat of authority, poised to become a cemetery. The city's defenses were formidable: colossal walls, multiple layers of fortifications, and a robust citadel within the city capable of holding out, even if the outer defenses were breached. The number of defenders, however, is a point of considerable disagreement among historical sources. Medieval chroniclers writing under Mongol patronage, such as Juvayni and Rashid al-Din, claimed figures ranging from 100,000 to 110,000. Ibn al-Athir suggested 50,000. Contemporary historians, analyzing the city's size and demographic, estimate a more realistic figure of 10,000 to 20,000 actual soldiers. Irrespective of the precise number, they possessed a peculiar advantage: 20 war elephants. These were Asian elephants, imported from India, rigorously trained for combat, bearing towers on their backs filled with archers and armored. They were colossal. Khwarazmian commanders believed these elephants to be their secret weapon. The Mongols had absolutely no prior experience fighting war elephants, having never even encountered one. How, they wondered, could horse archers possibly contend with these living fortresses? Nevertheless, there was a critical flaw in Samarkand's defense: morale. Word of Bukhara's fate had already reached Samarkand. The soldiers knew the Mongols had traversed the impassable desert. They were aware that Bukhara had fallen in mere days. They understood what had become of its garrison: total obliteration. Adding to the gravity of the situation, a significant portion of the troops are Turkic nomads, whose cultural ties are stronger with the Mongols than with the Persian Shah. Historical records indicate that upon hearing of the Mongols' approach, some Turkic soldiers in Samarkand openly questioned, "We share their lineage. Why should we sacrifice ourselves for the Shah?" The garrison's loyalty was, at best, precarious. And then, there was the most critical issue: the whereabouts of Shah Muhammad II. His rightful place was in his capital, inspiring his forces and orchestrating the defense. Yet, Muhammad was stationed outside the city with the remnants of his mobile units, observing from a distance. The Shah was already formulating his escape strategy. The Mongol armies descended upon Samarkand with the predatory focus of wolves on vulnerable prey. From the west, Genghis Khan and Tolui spearheaded the main contingent, fresh from devastating Bukhara. From the east, Chagatai and Ögedei, having concluded their prolonged siege at Otrar, arrived with heightened ferocity and eagerness to prove their mettle. From the north, Jochi, after securing the Sir Daria region, led his cavalry, seasoned by months of relentless campaigning. From the southeast, the tactical geniuses Jebe and Subutai arrived. 4 distinct armies, operating in perfect synchronicity, converged within days of each other. The Mongols advanced on the city along both banks of the Zarafshan River, and by early March, Samarkand found itself completely encircled. Not merely loosely surrounded, but hermetically sealed. Mongol cavalry patrols encompassed the entire city, blocking every road and monitoring every pathway. No one could enter, no one could leave. The Mongols even intercepted unsuspecting merchant caravans, unaware of the siege, capturing them before they could sound an alarm or deliver provisions. Genghis Khan then initiated psychological warfare. His first act involved parading prisoners from Bukhara before Samarkand's formidable walls. The stroke of genius lay in equipping these prisoners with Mongol battle standards. From afar, the Mongol army appeared to be twice its actual size. The defenders perceived a force of seemingly 200,000 troops encircling them. Secondly, he intentionally allowed certain prisoners to escape, but only after they had been thoroughly traumatized. These men rushed into Samarkand, spreading harrowing tales of Mongol brutality. They recounted massacres, arsons, and systematic destruction. Their accounts were truthful, as they had witnessed it all. However, their presence also strained the city's food reserves and intensified the pervading fear. Thirdly, the siege engines arrived. The Chinese engineers, as remembered, had been diligently constructing trebuchets and mangonels, essentially functioning as medieval artillery. These machines possessed the capability to launch 300-pound stones over walls from hundreds of feet away. They could also hurl pots filled with naphtha, a petroleum-based incendiary, essentially a medieval equivalent of napalm. The bombardment commenced, a relentless roar day and night. Stones hammered the outer defenses, while naphtha pots arced over the fortifications, exploding into flames upon impact. The outer districts of Samarkand began to burn. Wooden structures ignited, and smoke billowed over the city. Within Samarkand, terror gripped the populace. The bombardment was an unprecedented ordeal. The sheer noise inflicted psychological devastation, the ceaseless impacts, the shrieks, the grinding of stone against stone. Genghis Khan then escalated his brutality, employing the prisoners from Bukhara as human shields. He compelled them to the forefront of his assaults. As the Mongols attacked the walls, these prisoners, civilians from Bukhara, were driven forward first. The defenders on the walls faced a horrific quandary: either fire upon their fellow Muslims or allow the Mongols to advance. Most chose to fire. However, every arrow that struck down a civilian from Bukhara dealt another blow to morale. The psychological burden was overwhelming. This excruciating ordeal persisted for 3 days, 3 days of incessant bombardment, 3 days of futile assaults, 3 days of witnessing the Mongol stranglehold tighten. And then, on the 3rd day, the Samarkand garrison made a pivotal decision. They would launch an attack. On the 3rd day of the siege, inside Samarkand, the military commanders convened an urgent council. Quote 21 argued. Quote 21. Another asserted, quote 22. A third commander added, quote 23. This reasoning was not entirely unsound. Elephants in ancient and medieval warfare served as much as psychological weapons as physical ones. Their immense size and terrifying presence had a profound impact. Cavalry horses, unaccustomed to them, would invariably panic and bolt. The decision was made. A full-scale sortie. They would position 20 war elephants as the vanguard, followed by cavalry, an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 men, roughly half the garrison. The objective was to shatter the Mongol lines, scatter their forces, and potentially lift the siege. At a minimum, they intended to inflict significant casualties and demonstrate to the Mongols that Samarkand would not yield without a fight. The city gates swung open, and the 20 formidable war elephants emerged first. These were magnificent, fearsome beasts, standing 10 feet tall at the shoulder, with sharpened tusks, armored heads and flanks, and archers positioned in towers on their backs. Behind them surged waves of cavalry, composed of Samarkand's elite garrison, poised to capitalize on any breach the elephants might create. The Mongol forces observed their approach. Remarkably, the Mongol soldiers had never encountered elephants before. These creatures resembled something ripped from a nightmare. For a fleeting moment, one could almost picture the Mongol cavalry shifting uneasily, their horses neighing with fright. Then, the Mongols turned and retreated. The vanguard of Mongol cavalry wheeled around, galloping away from the advancing elephants. This wasn't a panic flight. It was far too organized, but their withdrawal was undeniable. The Khwarazmian commanders witnessed this and felt a surge of optimism. It was working. The elephants were effective. They intensified their charge. The elephants trumpeted loudly, and the cavalry spurred their horses onward. They were on the verge of breaking through, about to. The Mongol cavalry suddenly halted their retreat. They had lured the sallying force approximately a mile from the city walls, a sufficient distance to fully commit the elephants and cavalry, and far enough to complicate a retreat back to the city. Then, at a signal from Genghis Khan, the trap sprung. Mongol cavalry, previously concealed behind hills and in valleys, burst forth from both flanks, effectively closing the U-shaped Mongol formation. The sallying contingent found itself encircled on three sides, with the only escape route being a mile-long dash across open ground back to Samarkand. Arrows began to descend like rain. This was the Mongols' forte, mobile archery. Their composite bows could pierce armor at 200 yards, and tens of thousands of archers unleashed coordinated volleys. The elephants, those colossal engines of war, bore the brunt of the initial assault. Arrows peppered them from every direction. While perhaps not immediately fatal due to their thick hides, these were excruciating wounds. Arrows embedded in their flanks, legs, and trunks. The elephants started to panic, and a panicked elephant posed a greater threat to its own side than to the enemy. They trumpeted in agony and terror. Some bolted, others stampeded in random directions, including back toward their own lines. A few collapsed. The archers in their towers were thrown to the ground. Horses panicked as the elephants crashed into the cavalry formations. The meticulously planned sally dissolved into utter chaos. Then the Mongol heavy cavalry charged. These were not the light archers, but the 40% of the Mongol army who were armored, wielded lances, and were trained for shock combat. They struck the disorganized Khwarazmian cavalry with the force of a hammer shattering glass. What ensued was not a battle, but a massacre. The Khwarazmian forces attempted to fall back to the city, but the Mongols had already closed the gap. Cavalry fleeing across open terrain could not fight effectively. They were cut down by the thousands. Only a few hundred, out of an original 25,000, managed to reach the gates. The rest perished on the battlefield. Remarkably, the Mongols captured most of the 20 war elephants alive. They were impressed by these creatures and considered them potentially useful. However, elephants demand specific food and care. Asian elephants from India could not thrive on the Central Asian steppe. Within weeks, all 20 elephants succumbed to starvation and stress. The immediate consequences, however, were devastating. Samarkand had lost half its garrison. Its finest troops, its most dedicated soldiers, those willing to fight, were gone. The defenders on the city walls had witnessed the entire spectacle. They had seen the trap. They had seen the slaughter. They had watched their last hope vanish in the dust outside the city. Morale didn't just decline, it utterly collapsed. It was at this critical juncture that Shah Muhammad II made his fateful decision. Shah Muhammad II observed the unfolding catastrophe from a hill several miles away. He had genuinely tried to help. Twice he had attempted to lead relief forces to break through to Samarkand. The first attempt was intercepted by Subutai, and his forces were driven back with heavy losses. The second attempt saw Towi's cavalry block him once more, forcing him to retreat. Muhammad stood on that hill and watched the sallying force annihilated. He saw his capital, his prize, his seat of power, isolated and doomed. And he made a choice that would be etched in history as one of the most craven acts ever committed by a medieval ruler. He fled. Shah Muhammad II, the second Alexander, ruler of an empire stretching from China to the Persian Gulf, abandoned his capital. He did not inform his generals nor his troops. He simply took his son Jalaluddin, a few hundred loyal guards, and fled west. When news reached Samarkand that the Shah had deserted, the impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. "The Shah has abandoned us." Those 5 words reverberated through the city. The resisting defenders, who had clung to hope for reinforcements and believed in their ruler's eventual rescue, ultimately faltered. Discord erupted among their officers. Some advocated for continued combat, while others pushed for surrender negotiations. The Turkish forces, who had never desired to be there, started contemplating opening the city gates. Panic spread among the civilians inside the city walls. Food became scarce and water was rationed. The relentless bombardment persisted day and night, coupled with the realization that their leader had deserted them. The empire wasn't merely defeated, it was betrayed. On day 4, or perhaps day 5, sources differ, of the siege, within a week of the Mongol arrival, the primary city of Samarkand capitulated. The gates swung open, and a delegation of city elders emerged, bearing white flags, pleading for clemency. Genghis Khan welcomed them and consented to their surrender. He even pledged to spare civilians who cooperated. The surviving garrison marched out, having surrendered their weapons and adhering to the terms. They anticipated enslavement or forced labor, but at least survival. Genghis Khan, however, ordered their immediate execution. Every single one of the 20,000 to 30,000 surrendered soldiers was systematically slaughtered in fields outside the city, mostly by beheading, with some trampled by horses to expedite the process. This act stemmed from Genghis Khan's well-documented policy. Cities that surrendered immediately would be spared, those that resisted would be annihilated, and those surrendering after resistance would see their garrisons killed, though civilians might live. Samarkand's 4-day resistance was deemed too protracted, sealing the garrison's fate. This calculated act of terror served as a stark warning to all other imperial cities. Surrender at once or face total destruction. However, a small contingent within the citadel, the fortress guarding Samarkand, refused to capitulate. Approximately 1,000 of the most hardened and desperate veterans, with nothing to lose, barricaded themselves for a final stand. They sustained their resistance for an entire month. The Mongols launched repeated assaults on the citadel, incurring casualties. These defenders, skilled and despairing, knew their demise was inevitable and aimed to take as many Mongols with them as possible. Finally, one night, a small group of defenders made a daring decision: to break out. They understood their chances were slim, but remaining meant certain death, so they risked it. Under cover of darkness, they fought their way through the Mongol lines in vicious close-quarters combat. Most perished, but a few hundred actually managed to escape, fleeing toward the Amu Darya River, swimming across, and vanishing into the countryside. The Mongols, reportedly astonished that anyone had evaded them, apparently allowed them to go out of respect. The remaining citadel garrison was slain when the Mongols eventually breached the walls. With the citadel's fall, Samarkand was entirely under Mongol control. What followed was a systematic and brutal subjugation. The populace was categorized into 3 groups. The first group consisted of skilled artisans, 30,000 to 50,000 master craftsmen, engineers, metalworkers, weavers, scribes, and physicians. Deemed valuable, these individuals were forcibly marched east in a column towards Karakoram, the Mongol capital. They would spend the remainder of their lives as slave laborers in Mongol workshops, constructing siege engines and crafting goods for their conquerors. The second group comprised males of fighting age. Any man appearing capable of wielding a weapon was conscripted into the Mongol army. They would serve as cannon fodder in subsequent sieges, compelled to carry ladders, push siege towers, and absorb enemy arrows, with most dying within months. The third group encompassed everyone else: women, children, and the elderly. They were enslaved and distributed among the Mongol commanders. The women endured the expected atrocities of medieval warfare. While sources avoid graphic detail, the horror is evident. The city itself was systematically plundered. All valuables, gold, silver, jewels, and goods, were loaded onto Mongol carts, and the treasury was emptied. Then, the demolition commenced. The Mongols destroyed sections of the city walls, not entirely, but enough to prevent its use as a fortress against them. They also demolished the aqueduct system, rendering Samarkand incapable of sustaining a large population. Parts of the city were incinerated. The death toll was staggering. Medieval accounts claimed 100,000 dead, though modern historians consider this an overestimation. Nevertheless, even at half that figure, it represented one of the worst massacres of the medieval era, with profound psychological repercussions. Archaeological evidence reveals that the ancient core of Samarkand, the Afrasiab citadel, was completely abandoned after 1220. The population shifted southward and never returned. The urban heart of a city that had thrived for over a millennium became a ghost town. Samarkand fell on March 19th or 20th, 1220. While various historical accounts offer differing timelines, the Persian historian Minhaj Siraj pinpoints the 19th, a date I find credible. From the time Mongol forces appeared until the city's capitulation, a period spanning under 2 weeks, the heart of Central Asia, a sprawling imperial seat defended by tens of thousands of soldiers and 20 war elephants, was obliterated in fewer than 14 days. Should you still be engaged, my gratitude. This is an intense historical narrative, often brutal, but it reflects actual events. Such was the nature of conquest in the medieval era. Feel free to share your thoughts below. Should the garrison have resisted to the last, or was capitulation the correct choice? Let's discuss. One might assume the tale concludes here, with the capital overthrown and the empire shattered. Yet, Shah Muhammad II remains, continually pursued across Persia by 2 Mongol generals. As Samarkand fell, Genghis Khan dispatched 2 of his commanders, Jebe and Subutai. These names are significant. Jebe, whose name means arrow, was among history's most brilliant cavalry leaders. Subutai was arguably the most exceptional general ever produced by the Mongols, later spearheading campaigns into Russia, Hungary, and Poland. Together, their might was unparalleled. Genghis Khan provided them with 20,000 cavalry and a straightforward directive: locate Shah Muhammad. Prevent him from assembling an army. Pursue him to the ends of the earth if necessary. And that is precisely what they did. What unfolded ranks as one of military history's most relentless chases. It's spring of 1220, and Shah Muhammad II is desperately fleeing for his life westward from Samarkand into Khorasan, the eastern expanse of modern Iran and Afghanistan. He harbors hopes of reaching sympathetic cities, amassing troops, and perhaps launching a counterattack. His son, Jalal al-Din, a capable military strategist, is still with him. There's still a glimmer of hope, right? However, Jebe and Subutai's cavalry can cover 80 to 100 kilometers daily, steadily closing the distance. Muhammad arrives in Nishapur, staying only long enough to implore the city to brace for a siege before moving on. Jebe and Subutai arrive the following day, and the city promptly surrenders to avoid Samarkand's fate. Muhammad attempts to stop in Herat. The same scenario unfolds. He arrives, tries to rally forces, but upon learning the Mongols are a day away, he flees again. He attempts this in Merv, Balkh, every major city, and the pattern repeats. He shows up. The Mongols are right behind him, forcing him to keep moving. The cities are even unwilling to offer him refuge. They are aware of Samarkand's destruction. They know the Mongols will lay waste to any city that harbors the Shah. So, when Muhammad appears, city leaders practically beg him to depart. Quote, 26 consider the psychological devastation occurring. Muhammad, once seen as a second Alexander, the most influential man in Central Asia, now cannot even find a city willing to host him for a single night. And Jebe and Subutai just keep advancing. They are relentless, unyielding, always present, just beyond the horizon, drawing nearer. Muhammad grasps that he cannot escape them by land. So, in late 1220, he makes a desperate move. He flees to a small island in the Caspian Sea, near a port named Abaskun. It is a minuscule island, barely large enough for his small encampment. He hopes the Mongols cannot reach him there, that he will be safe on an island, that he can regroup, strategize, and reflect. He spent the final weeks of 1220 on that island. His son, Jalal al-Din, is with him, witnessing his father's disintegration, for that is what is occurring. Shah Muhammad II is experiencing a complete mental breakdown. His empire is lost. His cities are ruined. His people have been slaughtered. His own capitals, Samarkand and Bukhara, lie in rubble. Everything he built, everything he conquered, everything he called his own, vanished in less than a year. On January 11, 1221, Shah Muhammad II dies. The official cause of death is pleurisy, a lung ailment. In truth, I believe he succumbed to a broken heart, or perhaps merely the shock of utter, catastrophic failure. He dies alone on that island, a refugee in his own domain, remembered by history as the man whose arrogance and folly brought about the collapse of the Khwarazmian Empire. His mother, Turkin Khatun, the Queen of the Turks, is captured separately by Mongol forces. She is sent to Mongolia as a slave, spending the rest of her life in captivity. The woman who once wielded immense power dies in a Mongol prison camp. His son, Jalal al-Din, escapes and continues to fight. He is the sole member of the family with any military aptitude, and he achieves several victories against Mongol forces, including the Battle of Parwan. However, Genghis Khan personally led a campaign against him and defeated him at the Battle of the Indus River in 1221. Jalal al-Din survives that battle, but is eventually assassinated by Kurdish raiders in 1231. The Khwarazmian Empire, which had only 3 years prior spanned from China to the Persian Gulf, was utterly annihilated. Yet the Mongols remained unappeased. While Jebe and Subutai pursued the Shah, Genghis Khan's youngest son, Tolui, received an alternative assignment: to lay waste to Khorasan, not merely capture it, but utterly obliterate it. In 1220, Tolui, then 24 years old, embarked on one of the most savage military campaigns of the medieval era. His forces, comprising around 7,000 Mongol warriors augmented by Khwarazmian conscripts, ravaged eastern Iran and Afghanistan like a pestilence. The atrocities inflicted upon the communities they encountered dwarfed the destruction seen in Samarkand. When Tolui's army reached Merv in 1221, then one of the world's largest cities with an estimated population of 100,000, it immediately offered to surrender in exchange for clemency. The city gates were opened, but Tolui reneged on his promise. Every inhabitant of Merv was slaughtered. Chronicles indicate that each Mongol soldier was directed to execute between 300 and 400 people. Ibn al-Athir estimated 700,000 fatalities, while Juveni recorded a cleric who counted bodies for 13 days, arriving at a figure of 1,300,000. While these numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, likely by a factor of 10, even a conservative estimate of 70,000 to 130,000 deaths still constitutes genocide. Merv was so thoroughly obliterated that it never recovered, existing today as an archaeological site in the desert. Nishapur's fate held a personal vendetta. Tokuchar, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, had been killed during its siege. When the city finally fell in April 1221, the Mongols sought vengeance. Tokuchar's widow personally oversaw the slaughter, ensuring the demise of every living being within the city, not only humans, but, as specific accounts state, even cats and dogs were butchered. Children and infants were not spared. The bodies were stacked into colossal pyramids outside the city walls. Subsequently, the Mongols literally plowed the city under, demolishing every structure and tilling the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Herat was ruined. Balkh was leveled. Urgench endured arguably the most arduous siege of the entire campaign. The city's location in a marshy delta rendered conventional siege tactics incredibly difficult. The Mongols were compelled to innovate. Lacking large stones for their trebuchets, they felled mulberry trees and employed their wood as projectiles. They forced prisoners to fill the moat with their own bodies. After months of struggle, Urgench finally succumbed. The Mongols then diverted a river to submerge the ruins. The total death toll across the Khwarazmian Empire is impossible to ascertain with certainty. Medieval records cite millions, while contemporary historians estimate that between 10% and 25% of the total population perished, either directly killed or through starvation and disease resulting from the destruction of irrigation systems. Whole cities vanished. Farmland reverted to desert because the irrigation canals were destroyed. It took centuries, literally, for some regions to recover. It is crucial to understand that this was not merely a conquest. It was strategically engineered devastation. The Mongols intended to convey an enduring message. Do not oppose us. Do not disrespect us. Never, ever defy us. And they succeeded. After the destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire, other kingdoms and empires, witnessing the horrors, chose submission over resistance. The Mongol Empire would eventually command the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. All of this unfolded because Governor Inalchuk decided to pilfer some silver. What lessons can be gleaned from this calamity? For history's purpose is not merely to narrate events, but to illuminate patterns. Firstly, leadership is paramount. It is almost impossible to overstate the extent to which Shah Muhammad II's deficiencies contributed to this disaster. He was paranoid, indecisive, and ultimately cowardly. His choice to scatter his forces instead of concentrating them defied every principle of military strategy. His inability to trust his generals meant no one could organize an adequate defense. His abandonment of Samarkand utterly shattered any remaining morale within his empire. Contrast this with Genghis Khan, who was focused, decisive, and ruthless. Crucially, he delegated effectively to capable subordinates. He trusted Jebe, Subutai, Jochi, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Tolui to execute their missions autonomously, a trust that facilitated the sophisticated, multi-front campaign that brought about the downfall of Khwarazm. Secondly, unity triumphs over sheer numbers. The Khwarazmians probably possessed a significantly larger force than the Mongols if all their troops were combined, but these troops were fragmented, disorganized, and often disloyal. The Mongols, conversely, were unified, disciplined, single-minded, and operated with flawless coordination across hundreds of miles. 100,000 united soldiers will invariably overcome 400,000 divided soldiers. Thirdly, technology holds importance, but tactics are superior. The Khwarazmians possessed every resource necessary for victory: fortified cities, vast armies, and even war elephants. Nevertheless, they lacked the strategic acumen to leverage these advantages effectively. The formidable elephant contingent at Samarkand should have proven decisive. Instead, it became a catastrophe due to the sophisticated tactics employed by the Mongols. Fifth, arrogance often precedes ruin. Muhammad, styling himself a second Alexander, genuinely believed he was untouchable. He presumed he could disrespect Genghis Khan with impunity. This overconfidence ultimately cost him everything. Sixth, and this is a contentious viewpoint, but one I uphold, sometimes the victors are not the benevolent ones. The Mongols perpetrated atrocities on a scale almost unimaginable: widespread massacres, deliberate annihilation of infrastructure, and the systematic use of terror as a weapon. By any ethical measure, this was malevolent, yet it was undeniably effective. And effectiveness in warfare disregards moral considerations. The Mongol subjugation of Khwarazm transformed the globe, bringing Central Asia under Mongol sway. This unprecedented control allowed the Silk Road to operate under a single authority for centuries, fostering unparalleled trade and cultural exchange between East and West. Innovations like paper, gunpowder, and printing technology disseminated into Europe, in part because of Mongol dominion over these routes. Conversely, the conquest devastated Islamic civilization in Central Asia. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, once bastions of Islamic scholarship and culture, saw their intellectual traditions migrate west to Cairo and Damascus after 1220. This conquest also established the blueprint for Mongol expansion: overwhelming military might, psychological warfare, and absolute ruthlessness. This approach would propel the Mongols to the gates of Vienna and deep into the Middle East. So, here's my provocative assertion. Was Genghis Khan's retaliation justified? Absolutely not. The slaughter of non-combatants is never warranted. But was his response foreseeable? Unquestionably. Muhammad executed 450 Mongol-protected merchants and subsequently murdered envoys. He flouted every diplomatic protocol. He essentially dared Genghis Khan to invade, then expressed shock when it occurred. This isn't justice, it's mere foolishness confronting its consequences. What are your thoughts? Please share in the comments below. Was Genghis Khan's reaction appropriate given the provocation? Or is there no conceivable excuse for the extent of destruction wrought by the Mongols? I'm keen to hear your perspectives. March 1220. The ruins of Samarkand lay smoldering beneath the Central Asian sun. Piles of corpses littered the ground beyond the city walls. The magnificent aqueduct lay shattered. The city, once heralded as the most delectable paradise on earth, was now a desolate graveyard. It would remain so for a century and a half. Then, in 1370, another conqueror surveyed these remains and envisioned potential. He was Timur, Tamerlane to Western historians, a descendant of Mongol warriors, and he selected Samarkand as his capital. Timur resurrected the city, transforming it into a marvel. He commissioned the Registan, that celebrated plaza encircled by madrasas adorned with their exquisite blue tiles. He erected mosques, palaces, and gardens, enlisting artisans from across his vast empire to re-establish Samarkand's renown as a hub of art and learning. The irony is profound. The city obliterated by the Mongols was rebuilt by their progeny into one of the most splendid urban centers in the Islamic world. Today, Samarkand stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists flock to admire the architecture that Timur constructed. The ancient Afrasiab citadel, remnants of the pre-Mongol city, endures as an archaeological site, abandoned since 1220. The city survived, the structures did not, but the location itself persisted. And this is the essence of history. Empires collapse, rulers perish, armies are vanquished, yet places endure. Narratives persist, lessons remain relevant. The demise of Samarkand offers a timeless insight. Arrogance and ignorance form a lethal concoction. Shah Muhammad II believed himself potent enough to offend anyone, an assumption that proved tragically wrong, costing him an empire and millions of lives. Respect your adversaries, comprehend the challenges before you, and never ever underestimate someone merely because they differ from you. The Khwarazmians viewed the Mongols as primitive nomads, failing to perceive their organizational brilliance, tactical adaptability, and ruthless efficiency. By the time they grasped the true nature of their foe, it was too late. In 1218, a caravan of 450 merchants arrived at a border town, hoping to engage in trade. By 1220, an empire had been expunged from the annals of history. In 1221, Shah Muhammad II died in isolation on an island, a shattered man who had obliterated his own legacy. And Genghis Khan? He pressed on with his conquests, proceeding to invade the Jin dynasty once more, campaign in India, and lay the groundwork for an empire that would eventually govern half the known world. All owing to a single moment, one fateful decision, one profound insult. 20 war elephants charged into a trap. A ruler chose pride over survival. And a city named Samarkand learned the terrible consequences of incurring the wrath of the Mongols. The narrative of Samarkand illustrates the swiftness with which everything can disintegrate, how rapidly an empire can crumble, and the thoroughness with which history can be rewritten by resolute action and overwhelming might. This narrative delves into the perils of hubris, the repercussions of poor governance, and the cost of underestimating adversaries. It concludes with Central Asia's most prized city reduced to rubble, the prominent urban centers along the Silk Road demolished, and an expansive empire, once spanning much of Asia, relegated to a historical footnote, all within a mere 3-year span. I appreciate you watching this extensive look into one of history's most savage campaigns. Your dedication to reaching the end signifies a true passion for history, and for that, I am grateful. Please hit the like button, subscribe for additional content, and share your suggestions for future historical topics in the comments. Until our next encounter, remember this: while empires eventually collapse, Their tales endure.